Further ado, I will ask Dr. Wells to begin tonight's discussion. Dr. Wells.
Thank you. First slide, please. I'd like to make 3 points briefly. First, evolution has many meanings. In some of those meanings, it's empirically well established, while in others it's not so well established. In fact, it's highly theoretical, even speculative. Second point, Darwinism, which, as you'll see in a few minutes, I take to be a philosophical position, extrapolates the evidence for evolution in one sense to other senses, and it does this not based on scientific grounds, but on philosophical ones. And finally, because Darwinism is fundamentally a philosophical position, first of all, it is extraordinarily resistant to empirical disconfirmation, and second of all, it tends to maintain its power through political means and tends to be taught dogmatically. Let me back these points up. The first point, that evolution has many meanings. First of all, for some people, evolution simply means change over time. That's not what I'm discussing here. I have no quarrel with change over time. I am not a young Earth creationist and never have been. The literal interpretation of the Bible is not the way I read it, and whether the Earth is 6,000 years old or 6 billion years old, to me, is a matter to be determined by the evidence. So change over time is not the issue. If we look at the fossil record, however, we see that things have indeed changed. Living things have changed. The things that are around us now are not what used to be here, and so things have certainly changed in this sense, and this is well established. A second sense in which evolution is well established is changes within species. Changes have been observed in the beaks of finches on the Galapagos Islands, changes in bacteria acquiring antibiotic resistance, and so on. In fact, such changes have been observed for centuries, long before Darwin, in the farmyard, in domestic breeding. This is also well established. But last point here, Darwinism extrapolates this evidence for changes within species to account for the major changes we see in the fossil record. And this extrapolation, I maintain, is not well supported by the evidence. Next slide. Darwin's theory, briefly, which he called descent with modification, is this. If you look at the lower left at A, that would be one species, and every species, as we know, contains many varieties. If we look at the people sitting in this room, we see lots of variation. According to Darwin's theory, selective pressures from the environment over time cause that one population to diverge into several populations, and so on and so forth over time until major differences arise. Now, if we look at the fossil record, next slide, please, we could imagine, this is actually an imaginary sequence, the record is nowhere near as good as this, but let's imagine a modern bird on the upper left, a modern whale on the upper right, and the creatures below it are fossilized, showing various conceivable intermediates between the modern bird, the modern whale, and their distant common ancestor, shown at the bottom. Now, I don't claim that this is well established in the fossil record. As I said, this is a hypothetical sequence, although these are actual fossils. Now, according to Darwinism, changes in the population of that creature at the bottom over time gradually diverged and led to these major changes throughout time to give us the bird and the whale. But if we look at the changes, say, in the modern bird, as Darwin did, that's a pigeon at the top, Darwin looked at breeding within pigeons. The changes were nowhere near as dramatic. In fact, you always ended up with a pigeon. And if you released your selective pressure, you got back the pigeon you started with. So the question is, does the Darwinian mechanism really account for this sort of divergence that we would hope to see to account for large-scale evolution? Next slide, please. In a 1990 book written by an Ohio State evolutionary biologist to defend the theory of evolution and rebut creationism, Tim Berra used a sequence of Corvette automobiles to illustrate this process of change over time. And he said, and this is from his book, if you compare a 1953 and 54 Corvette side by side, and then a 54 and a 55 and so on, the descent with modification, or Darwinian evolution, is overwhelmingly obvious. Well, what's overwhelmingly obvious from this example, of course, is that what we have here is not an example of natural Darwinian evolution, but an example of design. Each of these automobiles was designed by a team of engineers. They were patterned on the previous model, so to be sure there's a progression here. But what we do not have is variation and selection. What we have is design. Next slide, please. So clearly, the similarities that are often used to justify the extrapolation of the Darwinian mechanism to account for all of life's history do not really demonstrate common ancestry. They are equally compatible with the notion of design. Now, I'm not saying they demonstrate design. I'm saying that the issue remains unresolved. The similarities could be due to either one. Next slide. Now, at the root of this issue of design is the following question. It's an important one. A lot of people see a lot of implications in it. They consider it very important for the way they live their lives, whether they answer it one way or the other. The question is, are or were all features of living things produced by undirected natural causes, as Darwin claims, or were some of them, maybe not all, but some of them produced by an intelligent designer? This is an important question. How do we go about answering it? Well, if we try to answer it scientifically, first, design could be excluded by providing evidence for a mechanism sufficient to produce a particular feature. As I've just argued, the mechanism that Darwin proposed of selection and variation gets us changes within species, but it does not get us the major innovations in the history of life that we expect to see in evolution. So this Darwinian mechanism has been observed to produce, I can't read the monitor so well here, domestic breeding, okay, as I said, has been going on for centuries. The Grants back in the 1970s and 80s, in a heroic scientific research program, observed actual natural selection on the finch beaks of birds in the Galapagos Islands. What was interesting in that case is that the average size of the beaks increased during a drought. As soon as the drought ended and the rains came back, the beaks went back to normal. So there was no net evolutionary change, but there was some evolutionary change. Antibiotic resistance, we certainly observe this. It's important medically, but yet in 150 years of studying these bacteria, no one has observed the emergence of a new species. Where is the evidence that this mechanism could lead to what Darwin says it can do? Next slide, please. On the other hand, we might answer this question philosophically. First, one could argue that the question of design is outside the realm of science, and I often hear this, but then if it's outside the realm of science, evidence has no bearing on it at all. And yet if you open almost any biology textbook or listen to almost any biology lecture, or not almost any lecture, but any course in biology, you will hear at some point along the way evidence presented against design. And yet, if you try to raise evidence for design, if you try to argue that there's some evidence for design, you will quickly find yourself marginalized, perhaps ruled out of court. You'll be told that question of design is not a scientific one, but a religious one. Well, if it were really not a scientific question, that evidence would have no bearing one way or the other, and that's not what we see. Second of all, the claim that design is outside of science is actually a claim that science is limited in its methods. If this were the case, the proper attitude of a scientist would be to express agnosticism about design. But instead we find throughout the evolutionary biology community claims that in fact features of living things are not designed. So instead of agnosticism, we find a very dogmatic assertion excluding design. Next slide. Well, once we exclude design philosophically, of course, the only mechanism that's left, by and large, is variation and selection. And this is why it's extrapolated to explain the history of life, not because it's scientifically justified. So because Darwinism is basically philosophical, next slide, It tends to exclude counter-evidence. First of all, it ignores certain features of the fossil record, such as the Cambrian explosion, that are inconsistent with the branching pattern of Darwin's theory I showed you in the first place. Second of all, it ignores the limits of natural selection. Third, it fails to demonstrate that this mechanism could lead to the changes that we see. And finally, in practice, no amount of counter-evidence is allowed to challenge the basic doctrine of descent with modification. We hear constantly about disagreements among evolutionary biologists on this or that detail, but if you try to challenge the basic theory, you run into a brick wall because it's basically philosophical. And finally, my last slide, first point, is that this control, rather than being maintained on the basis of evidence and scientific argumentation, is actually based on political means. First of all, there's control of academic positions and research positions, control of search committees and tenure review committees. Second of all, there's a monopoly, a virtual monopoly over public funding. I belong to several professional organizations that routinely lobby Congress for more funds for biologists committed to the Darwinian paradigm. And if a scientist applies for a grant that attempts to challenge the Darwinian viewpoint or provide evidence for design, that biologist will quickly run into the brick wall I described a minute ago. Next, people who do have the temerity to challenge this paradigm find themselves suffering. Dean Kenyon was an acknowledged authority on the origin of life back in the 1960s, but when he had the nerve to, in the course of a regular curriculum dealing with evolutionary biology, he had the temerity to tell his students that he thought that life could not have originated without design based on the evidence that he saw. He was immediately suspended from teaching the same day and was reinstated only with the help of the American Association of University Professors and various legal authorities. Roger DeHart is a high school teacher just north of where I live in Seattle, Washington, who has now been removed from his teaching position because he wanted to tell his students that pictures of embryos in their textbooks had been faked. And the way he wanted to do this is he wanted to give them an article from Natural History magazine written by Stephen Jay Gould. He was prohibited from doing that and subsequently removed from his biology teaching position because students were not permitted to see evidence challenging the Darwinian viewpoint. I'm not saying that Stephen Jay Gould challenges that, but he was challenging evidence that was being used in his textbook to support that theory, and he wasn't even allowed to do that much. And finally, I am not imputing any of this to Professor Palumbi, but in the course of my travels, I find myself frequently subjected to personal abuse for even raising the issue of whether Darwinism is true. And I find, in fact, that the word creationist is frequently used as the functional equivalent now of communist during the McCarthy era. It effectively excludes people from the academic community, can cost them their job, and it's basically name-calling in place of good scientific argumentation. And so for these reasons, I argue that Darwinism is basically a philosophical position maintained politically through political means and indoctrinating students.